Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Delta-8 THC, the latest research, policy, and opportunities. My name is Eric Sandy, and I'm the digital editor of Cannabis Business Times. In this webinar, we're going to explore the scientific and legal questions surrounding Delta-8 THC, a minor cannabinoid that's captured the attention of the hemp industry and the state-licensed cannabis marketplace. As part of this panel discussion, we're going to get into a broader examination as well of other minor cannabinoids and how they might figure into short and long-term business plans, as well as the responsibility on the part of licensed cannabis businesses to communicate effectively with customers on these fairly complicated topics. You're going to learn where Delta-8 fits into the cannabis market right now and maybe in the future, and you'll learn how to plan for adaptive business decisions in a rapidly changing environment. Delta-8 is just one part of a much longer story, which is the legalization of cannabis. Today's speakers are Greg Gerdeman, President and CSO of Nash CX, and Justin Walsh, partner at Gleam Law. Before we get into the discussion today, I just want to make a few notes. You're going to see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box. Please feel free to open that up and type in your questions as the discussion goes on. On the back end, at the end of this conversation, we're going to have a chance to get in some Q&A. We'll make sure to get to as many questions as possible. Also know that we are recording today's presentation, and we'll be distributing a copy of this webinar, the audio and the video, to all registrants via email in the coming days. Lastly, I do want to note, if you enjoy this conversation that we're about to get into, we're going to be continuing it and much more at Cannabis Conference next month in Las Vegas, August 24th to the 26th. You can learn more about the event, read up on all the speakers and all the sessions for the 3-day event at cannabisconference.com. Registration rates are going up this weekend, so you're going to want to check that out shortly after today's panel discussion. That said, let's get into it. I want to begin just sort of with a baseline set of definitions and maybe even some background. The resounding question around Delta-8 THC has been, what is it? So maybe Greg, on more of the scientific side, we can begin with you and a bit of your background as well, and just a definition of what is Delta-8 THC and what exactly are we talking about here?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. Thank you for having me. It's great to talk about this. You know, a lot of people viewing this will know this topic is getting a lot of attention. And Delta-8 THC is a cannabinoid, and certainly everyone involved in the cannabis industry now knows what cannabinoids are. You know, the name comes from those molecules that are specifically and more or less uniquely produced by the cannabis plant. And so cannabinoid is a term has been around for many decades. And Delta-9 THC, which is the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, as for many years, been for a long time was the only cannabinoid that got much attention. So Delta-9 THC, for a long time, like I said, was considered really the only principal ingredient of cannabis. Now we know that the plant produces many different biologically active, therapeutically promising molecules. Delta-9 THC is still, however, like the real workhorse. A lot of times we just call it THC, but there are many different, or there are a handful of different THCs. That's tetrahydrocannabinol. And that one, Delta-9, it just indicates where the placement of a double bond is on the molecular structure. So it's a chemical name. Actually, Delta-9 was first called Delta-1 when Rafi Meshulam and Gaoni described it in the 60s in Israel. So it's a chemistry convention. And if the molecule has that double bond just in a next door position, it's called Delta-8 instead of Delta-9. Delta-8 THC is called a minor cannabinoid. It can be found in much lower concentrations. Well, there's debate about how much one can find it in the natural plant at all, but it certainly is an isomer, an analog of Delta-9. It also has a certain level of psychoactivity that is considered to be less psychoactive, and it has gotten to be quite popular in different commercially produced products, because Delta-8 THC can be synthesized in a lab from cannabidiol, another cannabinoid, which of course everyone is very familiar with as CBD. So Uh, you asked for a little bit of background. I'll give the short story. I have a PhD in pharmacology focusing on cannabinoids. Since 2001, I started grad school at Vanderbilt University in the mid 90s and have studied the pharmacology of cannabinoids and cannabis and how marijuana works in the brain and body for about 25 years, and have been both on the academic and industry side, founding a medical cannabis company in Florida and a dispensary and in West Virginia. And I've been a chief scientist for a hemp extraction company. So I've been in different angles of this. Sorry to answer your question in reverse, but that's sort of where I come from a brain scientist turned college professor turned a cannabis industry entrepreneur. But Delta-8 is really a question of pharmacology, which is what I've my area of focus for my whole really adult career. And that's my intro to what Delta-8 is. It's kind of a THC light in its, as a single molecule.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to be touching on it from all those different angles there. And one of the other ones, of course, being the legal angle. And one of the other baseline questions is Delta-8 THC legal? And I guess there's different shades of that question. But Justin, if you want to sort of set the stage from where you're coming at this conversation from.
Yeah. So, I'm Justin Walsh. I'm a partner at Gleam Law. I head our litigation department as well as our hemp and all things cannabinoid department. In that respect, I deal primarily with helping businesses achieve kind of as close to regulatory compliance as they can in order to mitigate the risks of enforcement. And that means whether it's coming at you from local law enforcement, the DEA, the FDA, or the Federal Trade Commission. There are a variety of agencies that you have to deal with, even local departments of health. In addition, I also teach cannabis law and policy at Seattle University School of Law. So I'm coming at this with kind of a global background in this. And it's kind of the question that every lawyer gets the joke. The answer is it depends. And that's something you'll hear often from lawyers. Right now, the current state of things is that I believe there are 17 or 18 states that have bans or restrictions in place. There are 4 more in the works. And there are some that don't have official restrictions or bans, but are enforcing pseudo restrictions on Delta-8 through the Analog Act from the DEA, taking their cues from the DEA and or enforcing their own Analog Act so that they can use local law enforcement as a tool. And we've seen, enforcement coming from Georgia, which is technically a legal state for it, but they are enforcing their Analog Act locally. For those that don't know, the Analog Act, this might segue into something Greg can talk about a little bit more, but it's where a otherwise legal substance is chemically similar to something that is a banned substance under the Controlled Substance Act, Schedule 1, the government can enforce it as if it were on the list itself. And so that's the vague wording there, chemically similar. And here we're talking about Delta-8 versus Delta-9 and whether those are chemically similar. And that's going to be kind of the primary question as states start to look as to whether they're going to enforce this or not.
Yeah, and I think that certainly tees up the more immediate question I want to get into next. One last thing I want to say as we set the stage here is that over the last couple days, we were running a survey through Cannabis Business Times, as well as Hemp Grower Magazine and Cannabis Dispensary Magazine, just taking the temperature of our readership on Delta-8 THC. And while we are going to put together a longer feature on this, just as a quick note to everyone in the audience, it was interesting that the majority of respondents did say that they believe Delta-8 THC should be produced and sold in both the hemp marketplace, and again, hemp being the cannabis plant coming in under 0.3% THC, as well as the state licensed cannabis marketplace. Now, that's just an informal survey of readership, but having the majority of answers come back in the affirmative sort of gives us a sense of the appetite for, if not the sale and production, then at least the conversation about this. So sort of turning back to Greg with what Justin introduced there with the Analog Act, the other, I suppose, bit of legislation at least that I think is in the background is the 2018 Farm Bill, which teed up the hemp marketplace. So I guess the question then becomes, does Delta-8 THC, it's in this legal gray area, one might say, but is it being treated as a loophole, or does it fall under the Analog Act? Or I guess on the scientific side, what do you make of some of these competing documents?
Well, I mean, without trying to be a legal expert, I've known about the Analog Act for many years. I'll give a little background of me as a scientist is that I was one of the first people. I was doing, again, brain research in the mid to late 90s, looking at cannabinoid receptors at a time when very few people really knew what in the world they were, before the term endocannabinoid system had been coined at all. And I was working with a drug called HU210. It stands for Hebrew University because it was synthesized by Rafi Meshulam's group at Hebrew University. It was an ultra potent version of THC. The father of modern cannabis, Rafi Meshulam, it was a synthetic chemist. HU210 is something that I was working with. It's 10,000 times more potent than Delta-9. It was never something that was used to work with animals. I mean, to work in humans. And yet, even doing NIH-funded research, we had to lock down and get DEA Schedule I approval for this drug under the Analog Act. The reason the Analog Act was passed from a scientific perspective is so that the DEA and law enforcement in general don't have to play kind of whack-a-mole with underground chemists that can synthesize molecules and make tiny little change and say, well, this one isn't illegal because we changed this one little atom on it. The Analog Act says if it's substantially chemically similar to something that is Schedule I or Schedule II, then it too is prohibited. So does it, where and how does it apply here? I mean, my perspective is unequivocally Delta-8 THC as a molecule is an analog of Delta-9. It's not really an arguable point chemically. Now, put that in the broader context that cannabis should not be a Schedule I or Schedule II substance. That's never, ever been based in science. The whole Schedule I category is entirely, I think, a fallacy that those molecules don't have any medical use. But that being said, is Delta-8 THC an analog of Delta-9, which is, well, and is Delta-9 THC Schedule I? I have to stop myself because if it's a synthetic that's in sesame oil, dissolved in sesame oil as a prescription drug, it's not Schedule I at all. That being dronabinol, which is prescription drug Marinol, that's been used therapeutically for many years, and we know it's very safe. We know that there's plenty of scientific reason to think that Delta-8 is at least as safe as Delta-9 as a pure product, as an actual identified drug. So I have this conversation back and forth about is it legal or not. I think where I fall more emphatically and the sort of conversation piece, whether it's illegal or not, I think a lot of what's going on in the commerce right now, legal or not, is getting to a point of being shameful as far as chemists synthesizing products that have many different byproducts in them, reaction products that come, and the chemical synthesis is not terribly complicated. Actually, what I've kind of fallen back on saying is that creating Delta-8 THC from CBD isolate is simple enough to be dangerous because it's really easy to do, but it's harder to get pure, to get it cleaner. I'm not, and I think there are ethical problems with trying to figure out that process in a lab and then selling your work product to retailers and direct to consumers when there are impurities in it that are created by the chemical reaction, which are not created in nature when the plant synthesizes the cannabinoids, and have zero research on acute or long-term health risks. So I kind of stumbled across a little bit. I went from is it legal to is it ethical? These are all interspersed but important questions for the industry to be talking about.
Yeah, and dovetailing off that, I think the biggest part of confusion, and Eric hinted at this, is this difference between the Analog Act and the 2018 Farm Bill. In this case, there's legal doctrines at play that the layperson may not be aware of. But if you have a law that comes after a previous law, it's assumed that Congress knew what they were doing when they enacted that law. And the line out of the Farm Bill that gives us this pause as to is it legal or is it not, is the legalization of any derivatives of hemp, meaning that you can extract Delta-8 directly, or you can take CBD and do anything with it you want as long as it's derived from hemp. Now, that is an obvious conflict with the DEA interpretation that says, well, that doesn't take away the Analog Act. And there is, a lot of leeway there in judicial interpretation to say, well, we're supposed to give effect to both of those. So in that context, I think the way most courts would come down is to say that extracted Delta-8, which is what we know, not exactly economically feasible to do large-scale Delta-8 extraction in and of its own, versus synthesized Delta-8, where you're taking an otherwise legal CBD substance, absent all of the FDA interpretations and orphan drug status and all that, and changing it. And that's where I think the courts are most likely to land on this issue as it starts to come up. I know, very similar to Greg, I am very strongly believe that cannabis and hemp, should be available to the masses as are the chemicals in there. But there are concerns, and they go beyond just the extraction as well. With the simplicity of this and the easy money that has been made on this selling through smoke shops, you do have a lot of people that are throwing out products that may not have all the information a consumer needs out there, which creates a lot of exposure in product liability law, exposure under the Federal Trade Commission, exposure to seizure by departments of health as well. And so all those things kind of all interplay together when we're talking about the broader context of consumer safety within Delta-8.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to touch on here, and certainly going to circle back to the FDA mention, Justin. But in terms of safety, that's one of the other big questions too, and it's already sort of popped up in the Q&A box from the audience here is how safe is this product? And while this isn't necessarily a consumer-facing webinar, one of the questions I wanted to put to both of you was, Justin, you mentioned smoke shop sales, and I think we're all familiar with the roadside signage that we've seen regarding Delta-8 products to one degree or another. But whether we're talking about actual state licensed cannabis businesses or hemp businesses, I know there are state bans too. I mean, does Delta-8 THC fit into a licensed business plan at this point, or is it sort of more of an evolving wait and see?
I think it's an evolving wait and see. I know that the states that have weighed in on it, Washington included, they tend to take the approach similar to what I said, that the Delta-8 within cannabis naturally extracted is one thing, but most of the states that are regulating have very strict chemical requirements, labeling requirements, making sure that the product that is out there is safe when we're talking marijuana extraction generally. And so they're going to be very reticent without more to allow those into the shop. So Washington actually took the position here, and I pulled this up. Delta-8 cultivated in licensed LCB facilities that is derived from marijuana and not otherwise synthesized may be added to marijuana products produced and processed in the licensed system. Delta-8 created by a process of genetic or chemical alteration of licensed marijuana may not be added to marijuana products produced and processed in the licensed marijuana systems. And that's throwing back within this policy statement from the Washington's Liquor and Cannabis Board to Washington's Analog Act. So they're very mindful of that interplay between the Analog Act, the Farm Bill, and their own legalization of marijuana as well. And say marijuana, I just want to put out there, as I always do, that everyone be mindful that that word is a derogatory word that was used and arose out of xenophobia. But I want to be clear because cannabis is split into the two camps, hemp and marijuana. And until we have a better word for marijuana, I'm going to use marijuana to clarify.
It's a great point. And sort of picking up that thread, Greg, on that same note, there's different state interpretations coming out. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but also at the same time, any of the there is a lot of research into Delta-8 THC, and how does that play a role into the safety of these products? Meaning, I know there's one of the phrases that gets tossed around is sort of a lighter Delta-9 THC, so to speak. That's up to each person's definitions, I suppose. But what do you make of the interplay between research and state regulation?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a lot of research on Delta-8. There's a lot of talk about Delta-8 and products. And when we ask this question about how safe or unsafe are Delta-8 products, well, it's not one thing. That's the issue with such a distributed and not transparent manufacturing supply, or supply chain. It's coming from so many different places and it's increasing. Some of us have seen Delta-8 on the horizon for 2 years. And then about a year ago, a lot of the people in the hemp industry are like, oh, what's Delta-8? Now it's gotten where everybody hustling any kind of cannabinoid oil getting into the business has a supply chain to Delta-8. And it's really not that difficult to make. So this is a really important question. I don't want to be glib about it, right? I mean, I think cannabis is very safe. Delta-9 THC as a pill is very safe, although I don't think as efficacious as herbal cannabis. Delta-8 as a chemical product, none of it's extracted directly from the plant. I mean, that language from the Washington State is a little bit funny to me because everything is chemically altered from other naturally occurring cannabinoids. There is synthesis going on. It's getting cooked up in acid to make this product. And let me say, I've got friends that are very good chemists, that are very ethical retailers. I've got plenty of friends in this business. I've had opportunity to be in this business and have chosen not to. But Delta-8 is in some regulated state markets with the medical marijuana. I mean, Trulieve even Florida has had Delta-8 products for quite some time. I don't know to where they're extent they're on the shelf now, but that too would have been chemically derived from CBD. How unsafe is unsafe? I don't. Part of the reason why I look at this is kind of as maybe not a canary in the coal mine, but like a critical precedent setting moment for the industry, for regulators to figure out how to move forward with this, is because Delta-8 THC is getting its warm reception because it is a less potent molecule. Now, I also think there should be truth in advertising. When people have different experiences, oh, I took Delta-8 and it was really light, and it's like a low, it gets me kind of lightly high, but without the anxiety. And then tons of internet articles copy each other and say, hey, well, people say Delta-8 is like THC light. One, if you take enough of it, it can make you very high and get you very anxious. I've seen that happen. Secondly, to maybe undercut my own last statement, so many of these products have a lot of Delta-9 in them that if you're taking, a handful of gummies and you think you're getting 20 or 50 milligrams of Delta-8, maybe you're a seasoned user, so that's all good. You might actually be getting a lot of Delta-9. And lastly, forgive me if I'm being a little circular here, but I tend to think that a lot of people who are experimenting with Delta-8 and saying like, wow, I like this. It's functional. It kind of takes the edge off. It gives me a little lift. I think people are actually just starting to discover what a low dose of THC is like, and that that it's got tremendous value. Very few people that are real cannabis enthusiasts spend much time experimenting with 2, 3, 4 milligrams of Delta-9. And I think low dose of THC is oftentimes the best medicine, is what people need without getting high. But we've learned about medical cannabis as something that people sort of, titrate to feeling stoned. And with potent weed, you can get stoned really quick. And I think a lot of people are discovering what low dose cannabis can do for you. All that said, there are serious chemists trying to do good work to make Delta-8. I think it could have lots of good promise, but it is drug development. You are creating byproducts, including isomers of THC that do not exist in nature. I'm not saying the sky is falling, save your children. I think cannabis should be legal and grown, very widely. But when it comes to making it in a lab, um, it's you're creating other products, and it's drug development. And that's where I think there should be more of a drug development regulatory path for it, which is, bigger business and is questions of regulation and FDA at a different level. And if you can get investors in your company to support you creating a Delta-8 drug and finding routes to market, man, that's great. And what research is there to show that it's good medicine? Well, really the best controlled research is a single study that looked at Delta-8 THC in pediatric cancer patients in the early 90s to control as a treatment for nausea and vomiting. And it was very well tolerated and it was effective. And it's one of the many, many examples throughout the past 80 years where clinical evidence showed cannabinoids to be a promising therapeutic direction, and it was never followed up. So
Yeah, and kind of dovetailing off what Greg said, one of the biggest things that I heard from him is, you don't know necessarily what's out there in the manufacturing process. And this, I think, was a huge learning curve for CBD companies and other hemp extract companies, that you have to have a way to do recalls. You have to have batch tracking. You have to know what ingredients went in and where they came from, for a multitude of reasons. The first and foremost is consumer safety, because if something gets into your product that shouldn't have been in there, something didn't get extracted completely and cleaned up in the manufacturing process and has the potential to make someone ill or kill them, you have to very quickly be able to yank that product off the shelf, or else you're going to have to yank all of your product off the shelf. There was another interesting point that I saw pop up in the chat, a little discussion on childhood safety. And I think that's where we get into some of the problems with Delta-8 specifically, that apply kind of similarly to Kratom, in that they're widely available in these smoke shops, and smoke shops, as we all know, don't always have the best carding policies. I can't tell you the number of administrative violations I've handled where our state's Liquor and Cannabis Board, who also enforces the tobacco laws, have these repeat offenders that I have to defend, because low-level employees, quite frankly, don't care most of the time and have very lax carding policies. And if that occurs within Delta-8, and we see this get into the hands of people under 21 years of age, yeah, there's going to be more appetite for a crackdown and legislation on the state level, for sure.
to jump on that, I mean, the question of should it be available with the hemp industry or through dispensaries, regulated more? like that poll that the Cannabis Business Times gave, I think that's great, although it's to say what it should be is pretty wishful thinking. It's broad. I feel like there should be consumer awareness and education and truth in advertising. And am I that scared that a good, clean Delta-8 product is going to cause serious damage? No. But I think that it falls into the area of possibly inebriating, intoxicating compound that can have product that can induce anxiety, that can have negative side effects. And I think that companies that are selling it or retail outlets, places you can buy it, need to be identified. And whatever, it's not my ball of wax to talk about how a vape shop or a coffee shop or some other retailer should be licensed or not. But I think there should be some licensing and identification there. I don't think it should just be off the shelf. And in the ways that some of these, this will be a good segue, some of the spice products that completely underground illicit products that were really hitting the scene in 10 years ago, where synthetic cannabinoids, purely synthetic, highly potent cannabinoids, were being sort of spritzed on products like potpourri and consumed and being sold completely over the counter in unregulated businesses. I think that is a problem. And yeah, Delta-8 isn't those, but guess what? If a derivative of hemp is legal, not because of what it becomes, but because of where it came from, then we're a step away from having more potent cannabinoid drugs falling under the same would-be legal umbrella. Well, it's derived from hemp. So gosh, Congress, gotcha. You didn't expect to see that. It's happening. There, you can look on chemist chat boards or talk to chemists if you know them. THC acetate is a product that's getting put out there in certain markets, which is more potent than underived, unmodified THC, not less. There are chemists who are trying to create THCP, which is another rare, minor occurring, probably doesn't occur in most plants, cannabinoid that's more potent. And again, if the legality of these cannabinoids is based not on what it becomes, but on what it was derived from, meaning hemp-derived CBD, then that's a green light for making ultra-potent cannabinoid drugs that do have safety concerns and do have, whether it's from intoxication and accidents or actually causing physical damage to your body and brain. And it's really important to get these decision-making right so that that doesn't create blowback on what is a natural industry. Part of what gets me frustrated is I've studied the long history of cannabis human relationships, and I'm one of thousands and thousands of people who are won over and enthusiastic about where we are with this medicine plant. And we're at a point in history where we have the science and the cultural change to understand cannabis at a level we never have before, and go back to breeding for the diversity, finding the diversity of therapeutic uses and social uses and religious uses for cannabis. And we're getting drawn down this funnel from one aspect of the industry that wants to turn CBD into an ingredient for synthetic drug development. And, that gets me frustrated. And yet, CBD as an ingredient for synthetic drugs, I'm not against it categorically. I just think it needs to be transparent. You shouldn't be able to put stuff out there with a bunch of reaction byproducts you don't even know what's in there. And I have very talented, very intelligent chemist friends who run very accomplished hemp and cannabis testing labs who say they've tested thousands of products that are sold as legal, compliant Delta-8 products, and none of them are under 0.3 Delta-9 THC, and all of them have a variety of chemical components identified as peaks that don't know what they are. I don't know if that's toxic or dangerous, but we don't know.
And as a side note there, one of the things that I've seen crop up with some of my Delta-8 clients, this reluctance to get proper testing that can differentiate and really narrow down on that aspect of it. You should know everything about your product, not only nutritionally, but as far as the chemical breakdown, to make sure that you're not shipping hot product and that your testing lab can differentiate between the two. If you tell them to test for the Delta-8 THC and they don't have the ability and just test it incorrectly. I mean, I've seen incorrect tests come back because people are learning that their lab doesn't have the sensitivities they need. And I'm not a chemist, so I don't know, but I know that there are just as many labs that have issues as there are manufacturers that have issues.
It's tricky. These aren't, this isn't like standing on a digital scale and saying, okay, I'm 162, more or less a little bit. The instruments that are used to identify, the chromatography instruments that are used to separate these components and identify what they are very sensitive technical instruments. Part of what I love to geek out and get excited about this industry is how many people really want to dig in and learn analytical chemistry because of cannabis, and organic chemistry because of cannabis. As a college professor, it's like teaching biology students chemistry was like, I don't want to learn about organic. It's so hard. And it is, but the decarboxylation reaction of THCA to THC, that's organic chemistry, and people want to understand it, and that's cool. And people want to understand analytical chemistry, but these are very sensitive instruments. They have to be calibrated regularly. You have to have, the protocol isn't just about how much you grind up and run through. The validated methods have to be dependent on the machine you've got, the ambient room temperature you've got, how you do your process. And there are so many labs that have come up that don't have the size or the capacity to do the amount of testing that they're getting the business to do. Many of them are not DEA licensed, which means they can't get the same level of standards to calibrate. So it's not cannabis testing labs sometimes get a bad rap because there have been some unscrupulous things that go on, but it also is tricky, and a lot of it is just just trying to get a lot of business done and maybe cutting corners that shouldn't have been cut. Sorry if I went off track on that a little bit, but it's near and dear to my heart. The company that have formed and president of now, it really is a hemp commodity exchange, and a big focus of what we're trying to set up is the quality assurance piece, that buyers and sellers have to understand exactly what is being transacted to have confidence and trust and faith. And this industry right now, and I don't mean to speak too negatively about this industry that I really do love and enjoy being in, but when you're talking about big hemp biomass and distillate deals and stuff, and now that we're dealing with all these synthetic derivatives like D8, it's like you have with these synthetics, it's like the sensibility of big pharma as far as having molecular distilled products, but the oversight and trust of a street drug deal still. I mean, there's a lot of distrust in the industry, and we all need to come at it from different angles. But the highest, having high quality verified lab testing is really important. And I guess on that note, what I'll say is that a real problem is a lot of the cannabis and CBD consuming public and retailers have gotten real savvy on lab tests and what it means to have a full panel. Hey, do you have a COA? You should buy something from a producer you trust. Well, what does that mean? Well, make sure they don't have solvents and contaminants. Look at the COA. Look to see if it's labeled accurately. That's great, but it's also created a trust in the COA as though that tells you everything. And a lab test isn't going to tell you what it doesn't look for. And that's the problem with synthetics like Delta-8, because again, it's easy enough to be dangerous. Somebody might be taking a lot of pains to create a clean, controlled process, but without oversight and licensing in the marketplace, who's to differentiate that with a product that is more sloppily done? And maybe somebody threw in some reactive metals to speed up and make to catalyze the reaction and make it more reliable. That happens a lot, and those metals don't show up. Those particular catalysts, they don't show up on a standard lab test. Um, by the way, this is the same thing for cannabinol, CBN. It's kind of gotten a pass on this, but CBN is largely produced in catalyzed chemical synthetic reactions, as it appears in most of these products. And you know, not to get off, not to forget the point that I also am trying to make is that there are other products. You know, I saw a guy on LinkedIn just this week posting, "Hey, I've got your Delta-8 substitute. Call me, hit me up." He's got, of course, the generic bottle of some honey-looking gooey liquid that's supposed to be a new distillate of HHC, hexahydrocannabinoid, cannabinol. I forget the name of it. It's not new. It's been described since the 40s. These guys are looking up old reactions, and you can't even get a COA on this because the standards aren't there. And this guy was saying, "Oh, you got to trust us. We'll set the tone." No, that's just that's for as a company, you're playing with incredible liability, which also means you're creating human health risks. And it's just it's a shame. There's a lot of shameful practices going on in my mind.
Well, yeah, I think these are really, really good points. And I want to just take a moment to maybe reframe them because this isn't the first time we're having this conversation in the industry. It's not going to be the last. Greg, you used the whack-a-mole metaphor earlier. But turning to Justin, I wanted to reintroduce the whole CBD FDA side of the conversation. And if you want to pick up that thread, I think it might have a place here. But if not, I think the broader question really is, how should we be thinking about this whole galaxy of chemical compounds derived from cannabis from the position of a license holder?
Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase a researcher that I met on a panel out of the University of Michigan. That full spectrum is the way to go because right now the weight of the research is showing that the cannabinoids have interactions once they enter the body that we're still very nascent in our understanding of, but that the best effect tends to come from using what nature gave you. Specifically, though, with the cannabinoids, the FDA, for better or for worse, was very hampered under the previous administration, which led to some regulations that we were expecting, I think Q1 of 2020, never coming to fruition just to help clarify CBD, which, aside from the whole orphan drug status and companies that have synthesized this into drugs and made claims that CBD was never used for these things prior to their application, one of the requirements for orphan drug status, that even with the non-controversial cannabinoids, even just full spectrum hemp extract and CBD, you're getting, pushback from the FDA. And yeah, with the warning letters, they tend to signal their enforcement priorities and what they're looking at and still kind of allowing the market to develop. But right now, as it sits, neither hemp extract nor CBD have been approved for use in ingestion as in just a normal dietary ingredient. And that's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe, is the standard for that. You have to go through an application process, and then anything that's been generally recognized as safe can be used in food products. And then you have new dietary ingredient, which is a similar standard but used for supplements. And so far that hasn't happened. It hasn't been approved. So really, if you're using any extract of hemp in food or a supplement, technically you are running afoul of the FDA regulations. But the FDA has come back and kind of only gone after those people that are bad actors. Now, if they're going after people that are bad actors in the non-controversial cannabinoids, I think what we're going to see is some increased FDA and Federal Trade Commission FTC crackdown on these Delta-8 products, and that can be as broad as, you know, looking at adulteration, some of the issues that Greg talked about in terms of things that you may not be aware of within the products. And it could be just the fact that it's not generally recognized as safe in NDI. There's nothing stopping the FDA right now from beginning kind of a massive round of enforcement through warning letters to Delta-8 products specifically. And I would say, you know, if you are doing a Delta-8 product and you are also doing kind of a very above the board CBD or hemp extract program where you're trying to comply with as much as you can, you've got your batching and everything, I think that creates risk for the rest of your company by having Delta-8 in there, and it might make more sense to split that off into its own separate company that has its own risk profile that doesn't drag down your less risky company. And I don't say no risk, I never say no risk, but in terms of that, they are very different risk profiles.
Yeah, and Greg, sort of I guess a similar question to you, just regarding this idea that, you know, we're here talking about a lot of if P, then Q, and where does this fit into the broader, I guess, spectrum of cannabis products and cannabis chemistry, knowing that this isn't the last time we're going to have this conversation. And maybe this might be a good place to also introduce Delta-10 THC, which is picking up some attention on the airwaves, so to speak. What would you say to especially licensed businesses who might be feeling out this end of the plant, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I'll share Justin's affinity for full spectrum, you know, in my view, as minimally processed natural extracts as possible. I do believe there's real scientific evidence for efficacy there, and I include in that scientific evidence just clinical success stories that PhDs like me all too often dismiss as anecdotal, but I've been in this arena for long enough to see many different individual cases of clinical successes of someone who used a artisanal kind of cannabis extract, high CBD or high THC, and had success. But I think there's interesting more data coming out that shows that in a full spectrum, you know, entourage of an artisanal extract, doses of CBD are effective for things like anxiety at more the doses that we see that people use, 10, 20, 30 milligrams a day, as opposed to like the prescription CBD product Epidiolex, which, you know, people take hundreds of milligrams, at least for seizure control. Sorry, I may have gotten off topic there a little bit. You know, you ask about Delta-10 and other cannabinoids. Yeah, with Delta-10, I know what it is. That too refers to where placement of the double bond is. I first heard about it years ago. Again, I got a PhD in basically in cannabinoid pharmacology over 20 years ago. I've never stopped studying it, and I couldn't tell you with confidence what Delta-10 does. And I know people have self-experimented, but you know, until you get clean, well-defined products, I'm not interested in self-experimenting. I especially think that these products are worrisome, and when it comes to inhaling them as vaped oils, because again, I'm not that particularly concerned with Delta-10, but we shouldn't be flippant about what we're inhaling. If you've got something that's 95% Delta-8 or Delta-10, I mean, 5% may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about a chemical that you're ingesting in your lungs, doesn't need to be a lot to cause problems. And so I have a lot of caution. That said, I tend to err towards caution. I mean, if the hemp CBD industry at large had been led by me, then the progress on CBD would not have gone as far and as fast as it has. I mean, I was cautious about saying, well, no, CBD isn't legal yet. It should be, but it's not. You know, back 15 years ago. And So I err towards the conservative, but I have people talk to me about their business plan and their business model, and um, I would not be banking income or like you know, planning the build out of more stores based on the revenue that I'm going to get on Delta-8 or Delta-10 or other, you know, minor cannabinoid chasing. The income might be there, but everybody I talk to in this business just kind of has a sense that the shoes, another shoe's going to drop, or well, we're going to make money while the getting's good. And I don't mean to be too, you know, I do understand that because again, cannabis is safe, and we've all been sort of, those of us who've been just completely immersed in this industry and this, you know, culture. It's like cannabis is safe medicine, and so this must be just another negative smear campaign against cannabis. Um, I think I'm talking in circles. I do think that there's a lot of risk involved for plenty of good reason. That if you're building a long-term business strategy around minor cannabinoids, then you better really dial in the lab the food safety specifications of your lab, the training of your personnel, the you having a really tight chain of custody, and being willing to pivot and react to changes in policy when they occur, um, so that you're not on the short end of rapidly changing policy that makes your products and your inventory strictly illegal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everything that Greg has said. The other thing to take into consideration is that, you know, Delta-8 is a little bit different in that the DEA has talked about their policy with regard to Delta-8 and that they do consider it an analog. And that means that there's, you know, with the other cannabinoids, I, you know, we've seen some pushback from the DEA, but we haven't seen necessarily huge enforcement. But I think there is a very, a bigger risk with Delta-8 as to law enforcement getting involved. One of the things I wanted to point out is, you know, Greg was talking about that this seems like, you know, a lot of people are hanging back and that this is a shorter term business plan. And that's been reflected in the transactions that we've seen, buying and selling these businesses, right? Generally, business can go for 1 to 2 top line, you know, meaning your yearly revenue, and we're seeing it go for much lower. Generally, you know, we're seeing it go maybe 0.2 top line. And that's a reflection that these businesses are being bought and sold as not long-term sustainable plans, but short-term revenue strategies.
Yeah, with the remaining minutes here, I do want to touch on some audience Q&A, and I've been more or less baking a lot of audience questions into my own. We're getting a lot that are sort of overlapping. The one that I haven't touched on too much that might be a good ending point here is just sort of with an eye to the future, whether or not this conversation that we're having and the state by state responses to Delta-8 in particular, whether or not that's going to have a real impact on the broader legalization wave, for lack of a better term, in the US at least. You know, will these state bans impact state legislation negatively? It's come up a few times in the Q&A, and of course, we've got a really robust chat. I want to thank the audience for that. It's been great. I've been keeping an eye on that. But just from a personal and professional perspective, I know this gets into conjecture, but where does this fall in terms of the legalization question?
Well, this is a very interesting question, right? Because when we talk about where the industry is going with hemp distillates and extractions, it's been a mixed bag. And it's largely one that's been resultant on political will and political appetite. And so everything the industry is doing is being watched pretty closely. And those aspects of the industry that tend to fall in line with normal business practices are being touted by Mitch McConnell and calling on FDA regulation because people see this as just kind of a standard business, even though it's a little bit out there. And 20 years ago, they would have been very different minded as to this. But when you look at something like a Delta-8 problem, where it's involving the same plant, that starts to wither at that political appetite, and it could result in other innovations in the industry being looked at with increased scrutiny politically, both at the local and federal levels. I mean, even when you look down to departments of health, it's not entirely unheard of to still have CBD shops having their inventory seized by a Department of Health as being out of compliance with FDA regulation. So the more the industry strays away from kind of what I'd say, we talk about these liberal conservative views. Well, within the greater hemp industry, the more we stay away from the conservative, or the more we stray from the conservative end of that, and start going on these kind of new things that are quick money makers, the more we're going to draw overall scrutiny as an industry. And that's something, I'd like to see the continued innovation that I've seen in the last, 5-10 years, done in a way that doesn't draw that increased scrutiny.
Yeah. Greg, what are you watching on this front, in this broader conversation?
Well, laws are influenced by perception and people's prejudice and bias coming into things. We all have our bias. I mean, I've just moved back to my original home state of Tennessee, and the legislature here, there's so much interest in hemp and cannabis in Tennessee at large. Some really more liberal hemp rules in Tennessee. Some people really pushing the envelope with hemp products that you can sell with THCA in them. And but as far as the rules go, the legislature still seems to be very religious oriented, and like basically passed yet another law to sort of look at it. So man, the history of the human cannabis relationship is older than written history, and it's been a back and forth one. There's going to continue to be swings. Ethan Russo likes to refer to the history as one of cannabis interruptus, where you have long periods of cannabis being widely accepted, a base, the major base of the whole pharmacopoeia, and then it kind of disappears from the history for a while. Why was that? Some sort of moralistic crusade against it? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. I think to prevent that, we try to hold ourselves to be upstanding and to do the right thing. And that may just seem hokey or non-specific, but we are at a place where I think the large majority of American public realize that we've been hoodwinked as far as cannabis being more dangerous than positive. Cannabis legalization is more popular than any single politician, and the side industry or the aspect of cannabis, call it hemp or marijuana, cannabis-based derivatives, chemical distillates, for that to have legitimacy, it just needs to keep bringing in legitimate people who are upfront and honest. And I believe that cannabis is safe. And when there are going to be health warnings and scares like the vape lung disease, that broke out and happened, it's going to be due to things that aren't the cannabis plant. And that's why I tend to be more cautious about processes that go beyond just the cannabis plant, like mixing it up with an acid and turning it into something else. But it's not going, we're not going backwards, hopefully anytime soon, unless there's massive social collapse. And I think we all keep putting our best, most respectable hats on. We proclaim that cannabis is a safe medicine, that the cannabis plant is a diverse, incredibly useful, gift to the world, and that be thankful we're past what, we should look at the 20th century as a dark age of prohibition of cannabis. And I think we're still going to be heading in the right direction and work out problems. And I'm sure there will be sources of things like Delta-8 that emerge, but short-term, quick ROI kinds of business plans are going to leave a lot of people disappointed in the meantime.
and I will say just a little brief history lesson. It disappeared, with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which was a response to fear of immigrants over taking American jobs. It was a straight xenophobic reaction, which took it off the shelves. And you combine that with a alcohol bureau that had nothing to do once alcohol was legal again, and you have an act that has a lot of enforcement built into it with a bunch of federal agents. And yeah, it put the lights out on cannabis for a long time. So let's keep those lights on. Bye.
And it put the lights out on industrial hemp. And, I thank Cannabis Business Times and other people for pushing, intelligent and mature and deep conversation and public conversation about this, because it's too easy to say, well, we need to regulate it. Yeah, that's the starting place. What does regulation look like? The Marijuana Tax Act was regulation, and it wasn't strictly prohibiting it, but in actual act, in actual execution, it absolutely snuffed out the entire plant. And now that I'm working more with farmers on the fiber and industrial side more than I ever have, we have the situation of one of the oldest plants cultivated in human history, and yet it's entirely new. We have to come to scratch with new discoveries because of what's been lost with prohibition that started with just a strict regulation. So we have to be, engaged so that policymakers do things that are moving us in the right direction.
Well, certainly agree with that, and I think it's a great summarizing note there. Greg and Justin, I want to thank both of you for a really fantastic, in-depth discussion on not just Delta-8, but the whole context surrounding that. Again, it's sort of a moving target in a way, and an evolving industry. Cannabis interrupt us. I'm going to keep that in mind. So good backdrop here. But Greg and Justin, thanks so much for joining us today. I also want to thank the audience for being here, of course. I'm going to note that we will be distributing this webinar via email to all registrants, so keep an eye out for that. And of course, if you like this conversation and you want to pick up this thread in Las Vegas next month, we will be there. It's Cannabis Conference 2021 in person, thankfully. It's August 24th to the 26th, and you can learn more about the show, the speakers, the schedule, all at cannabisconference.com. Registration rates are increasing this weekend, so check that out momentarily here. Greg, Justin, once again, thanks so much. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.